Hello, fellow crafters. This is Yana Smakula for SimonSaysStamp.com. Welcome back for another Yippee For Yana video. In this episode, I have a Winter Valentine's Day card for a guy to share with you using some older products from Simon. This is an easy project to make and hopefully one that will inspire you to rush to your craft desk and create away. In my previous video, I shared 2 Christmas cards, one of which featured a ton of white snow added with the help of white paint pens. Since Valentine's Day is also a winter holiday and it typically snows on Valentine's Day in my neck of the woods, I do associate this holiday with snow. Hence, I figured it was fitting to add Snowy Blizzard to a Valentine's Day card. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's start from the beginning. Here's a look at all of the supplies I was planning to use for this project. I used pretty much everything but the white pigment ink pad and the clear embossing powder. I started to work on my card by creating a small sticky handle inside my MISTI stamping tool to affix the paper in place. I used Simon's Audrey Blue cardstock. It is one of my favorite colors. Next, I positioned the background stamp over the panel, making sure that the stamp was centered. This background is a stunning one from the center cut line from Simon. And as you can see, the center of the background is removable, and that makes this background a much more versatile one to use. This is the center cut heart background stamp. I treated my background panel with anti-static powder as I was planning to heat emboss this background. I like to tap on my anti-static powder tool from the back to dispense the powder and then use a dry paintbrush to distribute the powder on the paper. I always do this when I plan to do heat embossing as it helps to keep everything nice and clean. Next, I inked up the stamp with Simon's clear embossing ink. I made sure to add a generous amount of ink to the stamp, and then I closed the door of my MISTI tool and stamped the image on the paper. I repeated this process twice to make sure I had a perfect impression on my paper. With the stamping done, I removed the panel from my MISTI tool and covered it with Simon's antique gold embossing powder. It is my absolute favorite color of embossing powder, and it is probably the only powder that I use all year round for both Christmas and non-Christmas projects. Next, I used my heat tool and melted the powder in place. I made sure my heat tool was on for about 20-30 seconds before I brought it to the paper to melt the powder. This helped reduce the amount of warping and kept my paper relatively flat. And that's very important when you do heat embossing, when you heat emboss a full background like this one. I love the look of antique gold embossing powder on this Audrey Blue cardstock. It looks simply stunning. Now, to add some definition to the background, I decided to add simple ink blending. I rarely ink blend full backgrounds, it's just not my thing, but I do love to ink blend the edges of the panels, of heat embossed panels, for example, to keep the center free from any ink, as this helps the panels glow and it instantly draws the eye of the viewer to the center spot. I first used Simon's High Dive ink and ink blended the edges of the panel, coming to the center but making sure to keep that center heart free from any ink. I was using a rather heavy hand and applying a lot of ink, but I also was mindful about the transition of the ink so that there weren't any harsh ink blended lines. Next, I used Deep Sea ink and added just a touch of this beautiful dark blue around the very edges of the panel. I love the way it turned out, very elegant and yet wintry looking, I think. I started to work on a sentiment next. I first wanted to stamp and heat emboss it directly on the background, but honestly I messed it up by adding a wrong color embossing powder on top of my stamping. I added clear embossing powder instead of white, and thus I had to brush it off. Now, by doing so, I messed up the stamping and I wasn't able to add the correct color powder over that stamped sentiment. So instead, I stamped the sentiment in clear embossing ink on white cardstock. I covered that with antique gold embossing powder, the same color I was using for my background, and heat set it with my heat tool to melt it. I cut it out, creating a thin strip to place over the embossed and ink blended background, covering that messed up stamping. I used foam adhesive tape and adhered the panel to A2 white card base. Now beforehand, I also trimmed the panel down slightly so that a little bit of white from the card base would show through at the bottom of the card. I also used foam adhesive to foam mount the sentiment panel on the card. I really do like to pop a lot of the elements up on my projects. This just helps to add definition and depth to my cards. With all the elements adhered, I used Storytime paint pens from Jane Davenport and added a number of white snow-like dots mimicking a blizzard on my card. It's been snowing a lot outside lately, and I just could not help but feel inspired with all of that snow. I shared this technique in my previous video, and I simply fell in love with the look, so I wanted to try it again on this card as well. I'm glad I did, as I think it added a lot of interest to this project and it really made it different. Lastly, I embellished my card with several sequins from the Star Spangled Mix. I picked a few smaller blue and a few larger blue sequins and adhered them scattering around the background with the help of Simon's Craft Tacky Glue. I love using this glue to adhere little embellishments like these sequins. I also stamped a simple sentiment on the inside of the card that reads, "I'm much more me when I'm with you." Here's a look at the finished card. I simply adore that added snow, and I'm sure I'll be adding that snow to many other cards I make in the future. I hope you'll give this idea a try using these or other stamps from your stash. If you do, remember to share online and tag us on social media. We always love seeing what you guys are making. On the screen, there's a link to a playlist with all of my videos featuring Simon Says stamps. Subscribe now not to miss any new card making videos, and do hit that bell icon to get notifications. Thanks for watching. Love you guys. I'll see you next week.